Welcome to the Duct Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We often discuss the science behind our understanding of waterfowl ecology and the habitats they need, and then we use that information to develop and guide our conservation efforts. Frequent listeners of this podcast will recall many of those episodes where we've had fun talking about the neat aspects of waterfowl ecology and all the science behind that understanding. But today we're going to be shifting gears a bit and talk about some of Duct Unlimited's on-the-ground conservation work. We're going to be discussing this work in an area that most folks probably don't often think about immediately as being important to our conservation mission. Now, we are going to be going out west to California, but not to the places that most waterfowlers might think of whenever we say California and waterfowl in the same sentence. We're going to be going to the San Francisco Bay and talking about the work that we do in that region, as well as other nearby portions of the California coast. To help us with this conversation, I'm happy to welcome in Dr. Renees Spence, our Duct Unlimited regional biologist out in San Francisco Bay and the California coast. Renee, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Renee, for our listeners, let's start out with just a brief background on your history, your personal background, professional career. How long have you been with Duct Unlimited, and kind of how did you make it to the organization?
Sure. I started my studies in biology and ecology out in the Chesapeake Bay, although I am a California native, so made my way back to UC Davis for my doctoral studies in ecology and in particular wetland restoration ecology. I taught a couple of classes in biology and conservation and landed an interview with Ducks Unlimited about 12 and a half years ago, and have been there ever since. I really am passionate about conservation and the work that we do at Ducks Unlimited, and it is a lot of fun to work in San Francisco Bay and coastal California.
I have to ask you about UC Davis because we've had Dr. John Eady on a couple of episodes. Did you happen to work with him there at UC Davis, or were you just in the same department? And I'm sure you would have run across him there, but were you one of his students by chance?
I actually was not one of his students. And because my background is more plant-focused, plant ecology and wetland ecology, I actually did not encounter Dr. Eady until after I finished up my studies at Davis.
I did not know that. That's kind of a neat thing to learn about there. We're very, very good. So you've been with Ducks Unlimited for 12 and a half years. You're a regional biologist out there. And I guess for those folks that may not be familiar with kind of the way we're set up out there, you were telling me here beforehand that you actually work out of our Western Regional Office in Rancho Cordova. I think it's a suburb of Sacramento. But we do have some type of a field office closer to the California coast. Tell us about that.
Yes. So basically, we have a conservation area team that focuses on San Francisco Bay and coastal California. And that team is stationed out on Mare Island, which is right near Vallejo, which is in North San Francisco Bay. And all of us focus on San Francisco Bay as our highest priority, and also work up in Humboldt Bay and down in Elkhorn Slough on the Central Coast near Santa Cruz and Monterey.
Renee, let's talk about each of those areas in a bit more detail, because as I introduced, most people may not think of the California coast as being very important to the work to waterfowl or the work that we do. But starting with the San Francisco Bay, give our listeners an idea of why that area is important for waterfowl and why Ducks Unlimited is investing in it. And then we'll kind of do the same thing for each of those other areas.
Sure. So San Francisco Bay is a Ramsar designated site of international wetland importance. It is home to about half of the diving ducks using the Pacific Flyway. Obviously very important for dabblers as well. And its importance varies a little bit. It is contiguous with the Central Valley habitats that folks are probably a little bit more familiar with. And how important it is varies a little bit on what kind of water year we're getting out here in California. So this year, as an example, has been really dry. We haven't had any rain except 2 freak showers in August, and which never happens in California. And so this could potentially be another dry year, in which case we might expect to see more waterfowl shifting over to the Bay Area relative to Central Valley habitats than you might see in a wetter year.
You mentioned that the San Francisco Bay supports a significant portion. I think you might have even, over half of the diving ducks in that region? Is that right?
Correct. So hugely important for diving ducks. Also important for dabblers. We have a very large number of pintails in the Bay Area, a lot of gadwall, widgeon, mallards, canvasback, scaup are some of the most important diving ducks that are using the San Francisco Bay that we see in very large numbers.
And then what about scoters? They're in more, they're diving ducks, but they're kind of in a sea duck category. They're pretty numerous out there as well, right?
Right. So we do have 3 scoter species, primarily surf scoters using the bay, also white wing and black scoters. However, scoters are declining a little bit in San Francisco Bay, and there's an interesting body of work that John Takakawa and Marina Audubon and others have been doing. Sorry, I think that's Audubon, California, looking at Pacific herring recruitment, eelgrass populations, and scoter declines. And so it's an emerging story in conservation, but they think that there's a linkage with decreasing herring roe with the scoter declines in San Francisco Bay.
Interesting. Well, in terms of the other diving ducks, so we talked about the scoters there and sort of their foraging ecology, one of the primary foods there. But for the diving ducks, what are they going after out there in San Francisco Bay?
Well, I think that there are a tremendous array of food sources in the Bay. Obviously, they have changed a little bit through time. So wild celery used to be super abundant up in San Pablo Bay. It's definitely less abundant now. Our submerged aquatic vegetation is definitely a lot less abundant than it was historically. Invertebrates living on that submerged aquatic vegetation are definitely dependent on how much there is. But we do have a large number, fortunately or unfortunately, of non-native invertebrates in San Francisco Bay. And so there is quite a bit of forage availability as long as our ducks can be a little bit flexible about what they eat.
Renee, let's move up the coast a bit. I think Humboldt Bay was the next place that you spoke about that's important for our coastal conservation efforts.
Yes. And so Humboldt Bay is probably best known for the large number of brant that rely on that area. And there are tremendous eelgrass beds up in Humboldt Bay that support brant up there. And obviously, all of coastal California provides secondary habitat for Pacific flyway species that are using either the Central Valley or San Francisco Bay because they're migrating up and down those corridors. And so both the Humboldt Bay area as well as the Central Coast provide valuable stopover areas for those species.
Is the Central Coast, or when you use that term, are we referring to an area different from San Francisco Bay?
Yes. So the work that I mentioned that we're doing in Elkhorn Slough is probably the Central Coast is a large area. California is a very large state, but anything stretching from basically just south of San Francisco Bay, so Elkhorn Slough, San Luis Obispo area, that would all be considered the Central Coast.
And then what about Sasson Marsh? That's what, I spent a few months, maybe a summer out in the Central Valley of California back in the late 90s as a research technician. And I think I had an opportunity to go over to Sasson Marsh and tour it. And I know that's a historically important area for waterfowl. Does any of your work occur in that region, or does it fall within one of the areas that we've already talked about?
So Sasson Marsh is a hugely important area for waterfowl, and our Delta biologist, Aaron Will, has that area within his conservation region.
So is that considered part of our coastal conservation, coastal California conservation efforts, or is that treated a little differently?
It's treated a little differently. So I'm not sure if all of the regions do this, but basically for the Western region, we have conservation areas where we have teams that focus within those areas because they get to know the resources in those areas really well. And so the San Francisco Bay and Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta are obviously a connected ecosystem. And there are a lot of opportunities in all of those areas, and so many opportunities that we have the Delta and Sasson Marsh as one conservation area, and then the San Francisco Bay and coastal California as another conservation area.
Now, you talked earlier about how San Francisco Bay and other portions of the California coast can, in certain years, maybe this is shaping up to be one of those years, can serve as a secondary source of habitat for some of the birds that might otherwise or might first go to the Central Valley. And if maybe we have drought conditions in the Central Valley, perhaps there won't be as much habitat available for them this year. And so we might see more of these birds moving over to the coast. If I understood that correctly, what are we talking about in terms of the number of birds that we're likely to see there on the California coast? Do we have any idea of that?
You know, that's really hard to get a handle on. I think probably 7 million ballpark waterfowl use the Pacific Flyway. For San Francisco Bay, the single best indicator that we have is the midwinter waterfowl surveys, for which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been one of the primary funders. But for which funding has been cut. And so according to those midwinter waterfowl surveys, you know, I think those numbers are a little bit variable, but we see hundreds of thousands of waterfowl, primarily using North Bay and South Bay, primarily the salt ponds that we've been restoring and existing salt ponds in both North Bay and South Bay, as well as some portions of the open bay, particularly in North Bay and South Bay.
That's a great transition because I wanted to move next to a discussion about some of our habitat conservation work. I realize anytime I ask someone about how many birds are there in a given region, that's almost an impossible question, but I nevertheless like to discuss that. And it's impossible for many of the reasons that you talked about. Midwinter surveys are oftentimes it's a snapshot, right? And these birds are constantly moving around. But I was just hoping to get some idea of the numbers that we might see there. And so that's about as good as we can do, and I thank you for that. So let's move to a discussion of the type of habitat projects that DU is involved in, and let's start with the San Francisco Bay. You kind of introduced a couple of those, so expand a bit more on the type of work that we do there, what those projects look like, because it's an area that, as I introduced, is not thought of terribly often. Certainly once you get east of the Rockies as being important for waterfowl. So help us understand what we're doing out there.
Well, what a great opportunity to introduce a really eye-opening glimpse into waterfowl in San Francisco Bay. So thank you for that. So I think a lot of the work that we do really did start with the gold rush. So when folks came out back in 49 onward to look for gold, there started to be population centers and a demand for salt production as Europeans came in and colonized the area. And so that demand for salt production, basically Native Americans had done some cultivation for salt, particularly near the city of Hayward in the South San Francisco Bay. And that turned into an industrial salt production process once European settlers came in. And that process grew over time. And so there have been a couple of large-scale acquisitions of what were historically baylands fringing San Francisco Bay that were converted for salt production. And basically, state and federal partners acquired those lands, about 11,000 plus acres up in the North San Francisco Bay and another 15,000 acres in South San Francisco Bay. So those present one very large scale set of opportunities. Another of the really big opportunities that we have is agricultural lands. So you might be surprised to hear, or maybe not since you've been here, but there are still tremendous amounts of open space around San Francisco Bay. And a lot of the continued presence of open space is either attributable to salt production or to lands that are farmed for oat hay. So dry land farmed oat hay fields. And so I think by and large, those are our single greatest opportunities at the present time. Of course, moving into the future, there may be additional opportunities that come before us as well.
Now, Renee, I want to explore these salt pond issues a bit more, because I'm reasonably familiar with the work that's gone on out there. Having worked for the Gulf Coast Joint Venture for a number of years, we oftentimes interacted with our colleagues out there in the San Francisco Bay Joint Venture. And we got to hear about some of the very unique projects that they were involved in. And I know there are some of the same. We partnered with them on these projects. And for people that are interested, I would encourage, there's another one of those times where I will encourage our listeners, when you have time in the evening, or if you're sitting at your computer listening to this, go on to Google Earth and zoom in to San Francisco Bay. And at the south end of that bay, Renee, you tell me if this is correct, but you will very quickly, if you're looking at the aerial imagery, you will see some reddish rust colored areas that stick out right along the bay. Those are current salt ponds or salt production areas, right?
Correct. Yes. And if you fly into San Francisco Airport, you will see them very clearly, and you'll know that you picked the right seat by the window.
Yeah. And now the salt production, is it just sort of the old fashioned, you dike off an area and you pump some of the water in there and you let it evaporate, and what you're left with is sea salt? Is it that simple of a process?
For the most part, it is that simple. So down in the South Bay, they relied on solar evaporation, moving water through a series of ponds as it became more and more salty, until eventually they had basically a nice heavy brine that they would let crystallize out. And once it did form crystals, that would be harvested and shipped off to the various markets. In the North Bay, it's a little bit different because there wasn't enough incident solar radiation. So up there, it was more of a wind-driven process, and the footprint of the ponds in the North Bay to get from basically bay salinity to salt production is a larger footprint than it is in the South Bay. And in contrast, like if you move to the Caribbean, it's even a much smaller footprint.
So the salt ponds were built, and the ones that were built in areas that were historically coastal wetlands, right? I mean, that's the coastal wetlands that were there. And you can see some of these on the imagery. You can see the remnants of some of these coastal wetlands. But the areas where we still see the footprints of these salt ponds, that was historically coastal marsh. Is that right?
Right. And I think a lot of these areas were farmed first. So they were reclaimed for agriculture. So these berms were constructed around what they call islands, but, think about just kind of a marshy system, and where there were channels, they would build up a berm at the edge of that and then reclaim that to farm it. And in some cases, very shortly thereafter, some of those areas were put into salt production. It's possible that some of them did not have preceding farming. I'm not totally sure about that. But in the North Bay, a lot of those areas were claimed for agriculture and were in agricultural production for about 50 years prior to being converted for salt production.
What's the status of salt production there in the Bay? Is it still a viable business, or are you starting to see it contract a bit?
I think it definitely has contracted a bit, and that's why we have some of the opportunities that we do have, but it is a continuing business, particularly in the South Bay. There are some existing ponds that are still in operation for salt production.
Well, let's talk about how we take those opportunities and convert them into wetland restoration projects. How do we learn about these opportunities where maybe a salt production pond is no longer being used? I mean, what does that look like? And then, from sort of start to finish, and then what type of activities do we use in a restoration project there in the San Francisco Bay?
Well, those are some big answers to those questions. Well, I think some of this goes to, we have some really grounded partnerships with public agencies that want to restore large tracts of land all over the U.S., of course, but in San Francisco Bay, California Department of Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are the two organizations that became the recipients of these salt ponds. And we've been engaged from very early days in the planning for restoration of these former salt ponds. And exactly what that looks like kind of depends on what the landscape around these salt ponds are. And so up in the North Bay, a lot of the salt ponds themselves were islands. And so it basically was a pretty simple operation once the environmental compliance and permitting were completed to go in and cut some holes in the levees, in some cases lower down sections of the surrounding levees, and let the sediments come in on the tides. That's obviously a very simplified version of what we did, but because they were islands, there wasn't necessarily a lot of surrounding infrastructure that we had to worry about. And kind of similarly for some of the earlier work we've done down in the South Bay, passive restoration by selectively lowering levees, cutting holes in those levees to let the sediments come in on the tides and reconnect historic channel networks, has been a really relatively low cost, relatively quick way to start the restoration trajectory for those ponds. As we move to kind of the next tier, we're working on South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project Phase 2 planning right now with a number of other partners. And that's the largest wetland restoration project on the West Coast at 15,100 acres for South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project as a whole. We're looking at projects that are closer to the urban interface and closer to the population centers. San Francisco Bay has a population of, a little bit under 8 million, 7.5 million residents. Most of them are focused around the South San Francisco Bay and up on the peninsula. And so as we go into that next tier of projects, we're doing a lot more upfront planning work to make sure that we are basically maintaining the existing level of protections for those communities, as well as carrying forward the restoration project as a whole.
What type of footprint in terms of area do we have, does Duct Unlimited have with regard to wetland restoration in San Francisco Bay? Do you have that number offhand? I might be catching you off guard with that.
I can take a guess. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20,000 acres. So it's a pretty substantial footprint.
Okay, of existing restoration, but that wouldn't include the other project that you just talked about?
It would include parts of it, but not all of it. So that 15,100 acres is basically being planned in groups because a lot of species came to rely on those salt ponds for habitat. And some of them are federally protected species like the western snowy plover. And there's a trade-off as we convert habitats to think about what are we displacing with this restoration versus what are we benefiting. And so that's a very carefully planned process with a pretty extensive monitoring and adaptive management framework to think about, okay, given the lessons learned from this first suite of projects in the ballpark neighborhood of 5,000 acres, let's take this next phase 2 set of projects and let's continue to monitor and learn and feed that information back in. So the phase 1 restoration projects have been completed, and Ducts Unlimited partnered on a number of the individual elements within that. And we're now working on the phase 2 planning. It's likely that there will be a phase 3, and then I think we'll see.
Renee, that's another excellent transition here. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about some of the partners that we work with. You've already mentioned a couple of them, but I spoke about the San Francisco Bay joint venture a few minutes ago. How closely tied are we to them in our overall conservation efforts out there? And who are some of the other important partners that we need to recognize?
Well, we work very closely with the San Francisco Bay joint venture. And in fact, we're working with them right now on their implementation plan revision. And we work with them in all different capacities, ranging from conservation delivery to policy questions to funding opportunities. And definitely they are excellent partners. I mentioned already that we're working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Fish and Wildlife as our largest landowning partners throughout this region. We work quite a bit with Sonoma Land Trust up in the North San Francisco Bay. There's some up and coming efforts for Petaluma River and Sonoma Creek, particularly in the lower reaches of each of those tributaries to the bay. And Peninsula Open Space Trust has been a great partner down at Bear Island. There's another upcoming opportunity in Coyote Valley that we are hoping to partner with them on. Elkhorn Slough Foundation is a great partner down on the Central Coast. Up north in Humboldt Bay, we're working again with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's an upcoming project at Ocean Ranch, which is also a tidal wetland restoration project similar to the ones that I mentioned in the San Francisco Bay. And then we have a suite of funding partners that are maybe somewhat atypical for Ducts Unlimited. We have several state funding partners from the California Coastal Conservancy and Wildlife Conservation Board, the department, to regional measures like the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. They passed Measure AA, and that provides funding for restoration projects around San Francisco Bay, as well as federal partners that maybe Ducts Unlimited partners with more broadly, such as definitely the NACA program, but also coastal wetlands, through the Coastal Wetland Grant Program, the US EPA. NOAA has been a great partner, as well as in some cases, we've received money from federal highways for some work we did up in the North San Francisco Bay.
What about any of the major corporations out there? I know with our growing emphasis within Ducts Unlimited on ecosystem services, highlighting the many benefits that wetlands provide beyond just waterfowl habitat, and the simultaneous growth in environmental stewardship and sustainability initiatives within corporate America. Have we made any inroads with some of the corporations out there in that region?
We definitely have worked with several corporations and partnered with them on some of our projects. We just received a grant from Phillips 66 for some of our North Bay work. We have a new opportunity with Microsoft. I think that is basically just one conservation area over, but want to mention that. And I think that there are lots of opportunities to work with corporations. We do have Facebook as a partner down on our one of our South Bay Salt Pond restoration projects. I would definitely like to see more engagement from some of the tech firms down in that area, and hopefully we'll get there.
Renee, before I forget, I do want to, I want to say thank you for all that work. You've been a leadership force out in the San Francisco Bay behind a lot of those projects. And I also want to acknowledge and make people aware that you are one of the inaugural recipients of Duct Unlimited's Excellence in Conservation Award. So thank you for all of that. Congratulations on being a recipient of that award. I know it's well deserved, and the work that you've talked about here with us is an example of why, and all those inroads that we have made is part of the reason why you were recognized for those achievements. So thank you and congratulations.
Well, thank you. It's very humbling to be the recipient of that award, and it's definitely a team effort, and couldn't do it without the rest of the team and the support of Duct Unlimited.
So we've talked about San Francisco Bay and its uniqueness with regard to some of the wetland restoration projects that we've done. San Francisco Bay is also unique in how heavily urbanized it is relative to some of the other areas where we work. And so that's logically going to come with sort of a different group of stakeholders, a different group of supporters. We think about a lot of our other regions, and waterfowl hunters are some of our biggest supporters there. How much waterfowl hunting is even available there in San Francisco Bay? And then what does our supporter constituency look like within San Francisco Bay?
I think you would be surprised, and some residents around the Bay sometimes are, that there is quite a lot of opportunity for hunting around San Francisco Bay. And I think the opportunities are increasing. And you might be aware that there is a tremendous hunting heritage in San Francisco Bay. Going back to those early days with market hunting, bringing waterfowl in for the restaurants in San Francisco, with celebrities coming to hunt up in North Bay. And definitely a lot has changed since then. But I definitely hear from hunters about the rebounds that they're seeing in waterfowl populations in the Bay Area. And that's a really fun conversation to get to have. But as you said, there are lots of different benefits that the projects we're doing provide. And so there are a whole suite of ecosystem services such as sea level rise resilience, carbon sequestration, flood protection, water quality benefits. There's open space. There are recreational values for those 7.5+ million people around San Francisco Bay, as well as benefits to lots of different species, ranging from salmon and Dungeness crab that people like to eat to charismatic species like leopard sharks and bat rays and seals, to cute little salt marsh harvest mice that can actually swim really well, and other endangered species like Ridgway's rail. So I think we have a whole gamut of really compelling reasons to keep doing the work that we're doing, and the waterfowl are definitely showing up when we restore habitat.
I have to think that San Francisco Bay is a really exciting place to work right now for someone within Duct Unlimited because of our growth in our ecosystem services efforts. There was a recent article in a Duct Unlimited magazine. I collaborated with our ecosystem services scientist, Dr. Ellen Herbert, on that particular article, and we spoke about the history of DU as being rooted in providing wetlands and other habitats for waterfowl, and that's going to always be our focus. We're always going to keep that as our primary mission. But increasingly, we're finding opportunities, as you've described here, to bring in additional supporters on the basis of these other benefits that our wetland conservation provides. And so San Francisco Bay offers a unique opportunity to really see that happen and to make that happen. And then, of course, our responsibility as the science and conservation component of Duct Unlimited is to ensure that the areas where we are working are beneficial to waterfowl, and while also providing these other benefits. And so it's really neat to hear that we've been able to do that in San Francisco Bay, and it's also really rewarding and confirmatory, you might say, by us seeing a positive response in waterfowl populations, and that tells us that we can conserve wetlands, restore wetlands in highly urbanized landscapes, while also providing the needs that waterfowl have, and then drawing in additional supporters on the basis of these other benefits. So has it been as exciting as I kind of made it sound for you to be part of this in that region?
I would say absolutely. It is a really, really rewarding place to work, and really rewarding to be able to see. I'm thinking about a particular boat ride where I came around the corner on one of those ponds we were stored up in North San Francisco Bay, and probably 3,000 pintail flushed up out of that pond. And it's just really cool to be able to see that. And at the same time, to be able to see, we recently came up on the 5-year anniversary of one of our North Bay projects at Sears Point with the Sonoma Land Trust. And so we went out there to take a look at the site, and the amount of sediment that has come into that site in the past 5 years is just amazing. It's one of the fastest restoration projects I've seen all around the Bay. And it is directly connected to the Bay. So it's a little bit unusual in that regard, but definitely not unique. And it really has a tremendous array of habitat features, and just a tremendous number of waterfowl out using that site, shorebirds, fisheries use, and lots of people out there. It happens to be the headquarters for the San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge. So definitely things are slowed down with the current closures related to COVID-19, but they are still getting a lot of use out there.
I did want to ask you about some of our restoration projects in one of the other regions. But before I did that, I will give you an opportunity to mention anything else about our work in San Francisco Bay that we wanted to cover before we move on.
I guess the one thing I would say is, it definitely is a little bit slower to deliver projects in San Francisco Bay. There is a lot of planning and environmental compliance, permitting to navigate through. And once we finally get to that end stage when we're moving the dirt, that is just a really exciting thing. So.
Well, let's briefly talk about an example of our conservation work in one of the other areas, and I'll let you choose and maybe pick a favorite project. I don't want to say the favorite project because we all have multiple favorites. Pick a favorite project from one of those other two areas, and just to give people an idea of the type of conservation, the type of wetland restoration projects that we're involved in out there along the California coast.
Well, I think I won't pick a favorite, but I am going to zoom you down to the Elkhorn Slough, because what we're doing there is a little bit unique. We're working in partnership with the Elkhorn Slough Foundation and California Department of Fish and Wildlife down there. And we're working within a national estuarine reserve. There are a lot of marine mammals that use that area. So think about seals and otters, and in that particular area, we're doing somewhat similar work to what we do in San Francisco Bay with tidal wetland restoration, but we're basically the wetlands that are existing down there have eroded so that they are a little bit low. They're more like mudflat elevation rather than wetland elevation, and so we are basically actively adding sediments into those areas to restore them to tidal wetlands. We are then coming in and excavating out very sinuous and complex channel networks, and then continuing to partner with the foundation to advance that work in more stretches of the estuary down there. And the foundation has been very proactive in the research that they're doing to document and take lessons learned from that, and combine that with research in other areas to inform the state of understanding of tidal wetland research on the coast. And it's just been a really interesting partnership opportunity down there.
Renee, is the area where that project is occurring near a place called the Moss Landing State Wildlife Area by chance?
It is. That's another one of my favorite projects.
And I ask that because I am right now on Google Earth, kind of navigating around, trying to see if I can see the footprint of some of the work that you're talking about there. And again, I would encourage other people to do so as well. You can just type in Elkhorn Slough, and it will take you right down there to Monterey Bay and the particular area that Renee is speaking about. And I think it's just very instructional and educational to see the different landscapes in which these wetlands occur, and where we find waterfowl and where we do our work. And so this is a pretty unique area. And it offers a glimpse into a location and some type of conservation work that is, not necessarily, it's rather unique in what we do. So anything else to add about the work that we're doing down there?
I think that it's very exemplar of the challenges facing our coastal wetlands. In some cases, the challenges in Elkhorn Slough are related to kind of historic changes in hydrology down there, but also exacerbated by sea level rise. And I think that there are continued opportunities to increase resilience of our coastal wetlands. And the more we can be really thoughtful, but also proactive, I think the more likely that we are to continue to have those habitats into the future, to sequester carbon, to protect our coasts, and to provide the species benefits that we need them to.
Thank you, Renee, for all the great information that you've provided today. Thank you for the great work that you do for Ducks Unlimited. And again, congratulations on the Excellence in Conservation Award. It's certainly well-deserved. And thanks for providing some insight into an area that most folks don't think about as being an area where we at Ducks Unlimited are investing a fair bit of work.
Well, it has been a tremendous pleasure. Thank you so much.
A special thanks to our guest on today's show, Dr. Renee Spence, Ducks Unlimited regional biologist for San Francisco Bay and the California coast. We greatly appreciate her taking the time to tell us about an area that is unique and very important to waterfowl nonetheless. Additionally, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the work that he does on this podcast, getting these edited and out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.